Hey, good afternoon, everyone. We're still waiting for folks filtering in from the waiting room. So we'll give it another minute. And thank you for joining us. I'm Caitlin Coleman. I'm Water Education Colorado's editor of Headwaters magazine. We're here with our wonderful speakers and excited to bring you this webinar in partnership with Keep It Colorado. It's great to be able to partner with them and have their members and our members here, knowing we're not just hearing from and for water people, but also land people, and kind of bringing everyone together with a slightly broader reach. So I've been really looking forward to this webinar for a couple of reasons. One, it's a really interesting topic and we have these amazing speakers who are doing great work, but also really good at talking about it. But two, as you can tell, we're hosting this webinar as a Zoom meeting, which is different than the format we've used for the past 7 years when I started hosting WECO's webinars. So because of that, we have some special housekeeping notes before we get started. So I'll just run down this list, which hopefully you can see. If you aren't familiar with Zoom, you should have buttons at the top of your screen where you can adjust who you can see on the screen. So I'd recommend selecting the speaker view option during presentations. As attendees, please remain muted throughout the presentation so we can all hear and focus just on the person who's supposed to be speaking. If you want to communicate with one another, or if you have technical issues that we might be able to solve, you can use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. My colleague Scott Williamson, our education programs manager, is here to help with technical issues and mute you if you happen to unmute yourself. So he'll take care of you if you need anything. And of course, the webinar is being recorded today, so we'll share the recording after we're all done here. So those instructions apply to the first part of our webinar. So once I finish talking, you'll hear from our panelists, and then for the last 15 minutes or so of our time together, we'll move into a Q&A session. And that's where we'll get to put Zoom to use and hopefully have the pleasure of seeing your faces and hearing your voices. So a second set of instructions for that. Once we move into the Q&A, you can turn on your camera, but remain muted. If you have a question, we'd love to hear them. So Zoom should allow us to do that by raising your hand. If you go to the reactions button at the bottom and hit the hand raise button, then Scott will call on you and ask you to turn on your microphone. Or if you'd rather not pose the question yourself, you can type it into the chat box and we'll monitor that and call on you. But I'll remind you of all of that again later. So for now, let's get started. So for Water Education Colorado, our focus on land conservation and water right now is tied to the fall 2020 issue of Headwaters magazine. We tried to organize a webinar or two to take each issue off the page and dive deeper into the subject matter and interact with the characters in the magazine. So that's what we're doing today. Our three speakers were all interviewed for the issue, and they're in 3 different articles throughout the issue. So if you're just starting to delve into land conservation and water, check out that fall issue. We reported that increasingly land trusts in Colorado are working more deeply and focusing on water assets and their connection to land. But our focus today, of course, is on that next level work of some land trusts to tackle some of the state's biggest water challenges in new and sometimes regional ways. So we'll start off hearing from Melissa Daruna with Keep It Colorado, who will help us understand more about land trusts in Colorado and some basics of how they work with water. Then we'll hear from Sarah Palmer with Colorado Open Lands, who has pioneered a lot of interesting work at the intersection of conservation and water. But today she's sharing about a project focused on groundwater in the San Luis Valley. And then Ed Robertson with the Palmer Land Conservancy will share his creative project that's keeping some of the most productive ag land in production on the Arc Basin's Bessemer Ditch. And then finally, we'll hear from all of you with your questions. So Melissa is going to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I'm going to share my screen here. Great. So hopefully everybody is seeing our slides now. And thanks so much again, Caitlin and Scott. Thank you guys for having us this afternoon. And welcome to everybody. I know looking through the registration list, we had a lot of familiar names, but also a lot of folks that I don't know. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share a little bit more about Keep It Colorado and our land trust. And I'm very excited to hear from the other two panelists and have them share some of the stories of the incredible work that they're doing related to land conservation and water. So I thought I would start with a little bit of background around Keep It Colorado, knowing that some of you may not be familiar with us. As Caitlin mentioned, my name's Melissa Daruna. I'm the executive director. And Keep It Colorado is a nonprofit coalition of conservation organizations. In our membership, we have land trusts, we have public agencies, both at the state and local level, that focus on open space and land conservation. We've got a section of what we call our conservation champions. Those are professionals in the conservation space, ranging from attorneys to appraisers, tax credit brokers, and other folks that really help move the work along for conservation. We also have in that section of our membership nonprofit organizations that support conservation work and or work in closely aligned fields such as stewardship and restoration. And then we've got some really incredible funding partners as well that have really helped secure a successful relaunch of our coalition over the last 2 years, both of those being GoCo and the Gates Family Foundation. We're really fortunate to have such strong support for the conservation space through those partners. I wanted to take a few minutes to kind of tell you a little bit more about the land trust that we work with and what that work looks like with them. So let me see if I can advance our slides here. So the land trusts are the biggest section of our membership at Keep It Colorado. We have 25 of them across the state in our membership. And they range in size, the geographic scope of their service areas, from really localized to supporting individual communities, all the way up to some organizations that are national and international. And in the in-between there are land trusts that serve whole regions of the state or the entire state as a whole. And so 2 of those examples you'll hear from later. Palmer Land Conservancy serves a huge section of the state in the Southwest, and Colorado Open Lands serves the entire state of Colorado. Land trusts are nonprofit charitable organizations that help landowners who voluntarily wish to voluntarily conserve their land and water. So our land trusts tend to most traditionally focus on holding conservation easements, so the donated portion of lands and waters that landowners are seeking to conserve. But some of our land trusts also hold property in fee and either have those set up as wildlife preservations. Sometimes there are opportunities for education. So they're places where the community can gather to learn more about conservation or local habitats and wildlife and experience the outdoors. There's a lot of connecting people to conserved lands and to conservation work that our land trusts do, which I think is not always the first thing people think of when they hear about land trusts. So a lot of our land trusts, and you'll hear a couple of these stories through Ed and Sarah later, but there's a lot of work around connecting people to this work, to conservation, and specifically connecting that conservation from land into water. And so I'm really excited for them to kind of share how they've worked with people to achieve some of these incredible projects that they're working on. Land trusts work on protecting open space. They work on protecting working lands, wildlife habitat, and as I mentioned before, creating some recreational opportunities. Not every land trust is the same. Some of them have a much stronger focus on local agriculture, for example. Others have a really strong focus on overlaps between land conservation and water. Some are really heavily focused on habitat restoration, and many of them are really bringing in a focus on creating sustainable opportunities for outdoor rec into their service model as well. I will say that most of our land trusts currently have and are working towards more of a dovetail between their land conservation and water conservation work. And we know that there is a lot of opportunity for growth there and a lot of interest from landowners to better align the work on their land conservation efforts with water conservation. I'm excited again to hear some more of the stories from Ed and Sarah. Before I turn it over, I just wanted to kind of highlight what some of those examples may look like beyond what you'll hear from Palmer Land Conservancy and Colorado Open Lands today. We've got land trusts that are really heavily focusing on specific watersheds, for example, and the land protection necessary to ensure sustainable watersheds. Land trusts are working on water quality and engaging their private landowners to do water quality testing and learn more about their land management practices and the impacts that has on water quality, both for their property and for properties downstream. Some of our land trusts, as I mentioned, work really closely with habitat restoration and focus pretty exclusively on their efforts around riparian corridors and wildlife habitat that rely on them. And then a lot of our land trusts are also looking at creative solutions to better overlap their work with water conservation. And as a coalition, we are really heavily focusing on that as well. So we're engaging in some planning for the future. An example of that is the coalition, Keep It Colorado, is working to launch a statewide private lands conservation plan this year. And it is closely aligning with the timing for the update to the Colorado Water Plan. And there's some strategy behind that. We really hope to ensure that objectives for private land conservation can reflect the objectives for water conservation through the Colorado Water Plan, and that the objectives for private land conservation can in turn help advise those objectives that are reflected in the water plan, so that the two plans are really working in concert and we're better able to, pun intended, row in the same direction with our conservation efforts. In addition to that planning effort, we're closely following other bigger statewide planning efforts and ensuring that we're bringing the lens of the connection between water and land conservation to broader efforts, planning efforts across the state as well. And then we're looking at new strategies and tools. This year, we're hoping to advance some legislation that would create more opportunities for certain types of water conservation entities to partner with land trusts and be able to more directly access the conservation easement tax credit program as landowners who are able to convey conservation easements and tap into the tax credit incentive there. We know that there are great opportunities for partnership and to better align the strategic plans in certain regions of the state around land and water conservation, and, for example, help keep water on working lands and protect local agriculture economies. And then we're also looking at alternative valuation models and increasing sort of the tools in the toolbox for conservation. And that includes taking a close look at the way that we value conservation easements currently, which is based on landowners giving up development rights. And what opportunities exist for us to incentivize landowners and base their easements on the value that's present on their land. So what are the conservation values, water included, that exist on their land, and how do we more appropriately value an easement based on that? So a lot of really great and exciting things on the horizon that our coalition is working towards. And I'm just really excited to kind of see where this year takes us, and really excited to continue to elevate some of the work that many of our members are doing, especially that work at Colorado Open Lands and at Palmer Land Conservancy. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Ed to start, because I'm not quite sure. I think that's probably.
And I'm on, Melissa.
Okay, great. Then Sarah's here. So actually, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Palmer with Colorado Open Lands. Sarah's going to talk about some of the work at Colorado Open Lands, but also just give us a little bit of a snapshot of more traditionally what the transactions kind of look like when you overlap water conservation with land conservation efforts. So thanks so much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Palmer, and I work for Colorado Open Lands, and I was having some technical difficulties this morning. So thanks to Caitlin and everyone for bearing with me. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Here, we'll get started. So just to give, can everyone see that all right? Great, great. So just to give you a little bit of an overview from the high-level transactional lens, a conservation easement is at its heart a real estate transaction. It's a voluntary agreement that's on a specific piece of property, and it's a negotiated agreement really between a private landowner and a land trust like Colorado Open Lands or another holder that restricts or prohibits certain uses of a property and its water rights in order to protect that property's resources and conservation values forever. And while the conservation easement restrictions are typically designed and centered on those public benefits, those conservation values that a property has, as Melissa touched on, there's a difference between those public values, those conservation values, and the financial value of a conservation easement. So I just wanted to quickly touch on that. A conservation easement is financially valued really based on how its restrictions impact its marketability. So you're comparing the before value with no restrictions. So what would someone pay for this land and water today versus what they would pay after those restrictions are placed on the property? Land and water are often valued together by an appraiser, but a separate valuation of the water rights might be warranted in places where there's an active water market, where water is really changing hands and changing uses often. So how are water rights typically treated in conservation easements? We've long recognized that all of these public benefits that are really the reason why we do these conservation easements are really dependent on and supported by the water rights associated with the land. It's not just the land, it's the water as well. And so as land trusts became more familiar with water rights, we became pretty good at really tying those water rights to the land. So typical traditional restrictions would say, that water must be continued in its historic use. You cannot lease it, you cannot sell it. There's been some flexibility and especially acceptance by conservation easement funders that some flexibility for leasing may be beneficial, but a lot of traditional conservation easements kind of locked water rights in this very restrictive way. So as you can imagine, with valuation, those places that had a more water rights activity would have a higher conservation easement value if you're restricting what you can do with those water rights. And this traditional approach of really tying water rights to the land continues to be really important in many places because senior water rights, the oldest water rights in each river system, really serve as a kind of keystone. And once you remove those, there can be an ecological and economic cascade effect that really leaves communities high and dry. And I know Ed will speak to this more in his presentation. But as we look to the future of Colorado's growing population, of a warming climate where we know that there's growing pressure on Colorado's water resources, there's also a growing pressure for water users to change the status quo, to really use water in every single drop of water in more ways than we have before. And I think this really provides an opportunity for the land trust to kind of think beyond this traditional parcel by parcel approach and bring our tools to the table to address Colorado's water challenge. And I would argue that land trusts really need to be at the table because we're involved in permanent land and water use decisions across the state, but also because we're talking to communities about their vision for the future. We have relationships with landowners. We bring collaborative expertise and the ability to leverage different sources of funding. And we're trusted as a partner who has a long-term investment in resource protection. So what exactly do we lose if we can't change the status quo? I think this is really outlined by the Colorado Water Plan. When it first came out, it showed that every single river basin across the state is going to be impacted. Statewide, we're going to lose over 500,000 acres of irrigated land. So about 20% of our irrigated land across the state. And the scale of this issue, while the magnitude is different across river basins, this is really a statewide issue that impacts all of us and requires that land conservation and water communities work together towards solutions. Now, there's really two kind of primary drivers of this change, of this loss in irrigated acreage. The first is really conversion from agricultural use to municipal use, often through the purchase of irrigated land and the removal of those water rights. And the second is the decline of Colorado's groundwater aquifers. Today, you'll hear Ed and I speak to the ways that each of our land trusts are really working to address these two drivers. Ed is going to focus on the Arkansas Basin, which has already seen a lot of its water leave and is anticipated to lose more. And my organization, Colorado Open Lands, is also addressing competing agricultural and municipal use in the South Platte Basin in particular, where we're working to couple conservation easements with water sharing agreements between farmers and cities. But today, I want to take you down to the San Luis Valley, where we're really working in the Rio Grande Basin to address their groundwater aquifers. In the San Luis Valley, culture, economy, ecology, these are all connected to water. The San Luis Valley is home to the state's oldest water rights, which support rich traditions of community ditch cleanings, neighbors helping neighbors. Approximately 70% of local income is based on the agricultural economy in the valley, which supports the nation's second largest potato growing region. Watch out, Idaho. And the valley is also known for its barley production, which ends up in a lot of our Colorado beer, which I am grateful for, but also supports the cranes, the significant Rocky Mountain Sandhill crane population, which stops over in the San Luis Valley during the fall and the spring. The San Luis Valley is a priority landscape across many national bird conservation plans, in large part because of its incredible wetland ecosystems. But those wetlands are really intertwined with agriculture. The majority of wetlands occur on private property, and they're really supported by and maintained through irrigation. Now, hopefully, when you think of water in the San Luis Valley, maybe you have a fun memory like this one of playing in Medno Creek in the Great Sand Dunes National Park. But like the wind dynamics that created this national wonder of the sand dunes, the valley's water dynamic is also pretty complex and fascinating. The San Luis Valley is bounded by two mountain ranges, the San Juans to the west and the Sangre de Cristos to the east. And as the snow melts on these two ranges, it flows into the rivers and creeks, but it also flows into two groundwater aquifers. There's a top aquifer, which is an unconfined aquifer, and then there's a pressurized confined aquifer beneath a layer of clay. And these green agricultural fields, which represent that culture, economy, ecology that we just spoke about, are really dependent on both the surface water and groundwater in these aquifers. There are approximately 4,500 wells that draw on these two aquifers. Now, over the years, these aquifers, particularly the deep confined aquifer, have been seen as kind of a magical spring that could be tapped. And beginning in the 1970s, the San Luis Valley has faced a proposal at least once a decade to tap this aquifer and export the water to the Front Range. And they've come together as a community to really fend off each of these proposals over time. But the San Luis Valley not only faces these external pressures, it faces a significant internal one as well. As agriculture grew and changed in the San Luis Valley, and as technology and well capacity improved, it was discovered that water was leaving the aquifers much faster than it could be replaced. Well, I have to apologize. I don't want you to try to lean in and have to read this, and I promise I'll walk you through this graph. On the y-axis, you'll see the depth of the unconfined aquifer in the San Luis Valley. And on the x-axis, you have time, you have years. And well, you can see that the aquifer levels really fluctuate over time depending on snowpack and climatic conditions. What you really get from this picture is that the general trend is not good. This measurement starts in the late 1970s, and you can see kind of a nice wet period in the 1980s and 1990s. And then you have the devastating drought of 2002, which hit so much of Colorado and really started this precipitous decline in this aquifer, which has yet to continue, or has yet to recover. The red line is the level of sustainability that's been determined by the state. So the division engineer has said, you need to make progress towards this red line in the next 10 years, where we're going to start shutting off wells across the valley. And what they really need in the unconfined aquifer, this represents about 80,000 acre feet a year of water savings. And just in case not all of you are water engineers, just a reminder that an acre foot is what it would take to flood a football field with about 1 foot depth of water, or it's about the amount of water used by 1 to 2 households in Colorado a year. So it's quite a significant water savings that they need. And it's a daunting challenge. And the community has really come together to try to take steps to mitigate this crisis, this challenge. They've taxed their pumping. They've created groundwater subdistricts and taxed their pumping, using those funds to try to pay farmers to temporarily fallow their fields. In one of the subdistricts, they have also implemented, in conjunction with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, USDA, they have helped fund the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, Conservation Resource Enhancement Program, otherwise lovingly known as CREP, which is really a federal fallowing program. And so that pays farmers to fallow their fields either for a period of 15 years or perpetually. But it really is kind of an all or nothing proposition. So that area has to be fallowed. Well, some farmers have enrolled in the CREP program. There are a lot of farmers who really want to keep farming in the San Luis Valley if they can. And so they don't necessarily want to completely fallow. Some of these farmers have been willing to enter into annual agreements that these districts have started to offer, but these efforts just really haven't been enough. In 2018, Colorado Open Lands and the local land trust, Rio Grande Headwaters Land Trust, began meeting with water management districts to try to see if we could bring some additional tools to bear to the situation. In 2019, we held a series of 7 outreach meetings with irrigators in each of the groundwater subdistricts. And we really heard kind of 2 different things. From the groundwater managers, we heard, we're spending too much of our money on water supplies that are just meeting the need each year. But we can't get ahead of this. We really have to start funding long-term solutions. On the other hand, from the farmers, we heard, we really need flexibility. We don't necessarily want to enter into these complete foul agreements. That just doesn't necessarily work for the diversity of agricultural operations around the valley. So we need flexibility. And so we thought, there might be something to this, because conservation easements offer permanence. They offer permanent enforceability, but they also can offer flexibility because they can be individually tailored to a particular property, to a particular agricultural operation. So we thought, we can really bring these things to bear and create kind of a different tool. We can use some of the good things about conservation easements, but we can really focus them on groundwater. So instead of focusing on restrictions on land use on the surface of the property, we're going to focus on limiting pumping. And we spent about a year working with the groundwater districts, working with the division engineer's office to figure out how to best structure these. And we said, do we base this on historic consumptive use? What do we use as kind of the benchmark to reduce pumping? Most of the wells in the San Luis Valley have been metered. They have on-site meters for each well, and they've been in place for 10 to 11 years at this point. And so we agreed that really the most straightforward, the easiest to enforce thing would be to use an average of those last years of pumping data and base the restrictions on that number. And the landowner would be able to come to us and say, here's what I think would work for my operation. So that might look like, and they would be able to manage their farm to adjust their operations in the best way for them to achieve those water savings. So for example, if somebody had 3 circles, they might say, I can reduce my pumping by 30%. And the way that I'm going to do that, at least at the beginning, is to rotationally fallow one of those circles each year. And that's going to be the best thing for my operation. And that might look different for another operation, and that's okay. But to be able to give the farmer really the ability to drive what that reduction is and how they achieve it is kind of the difference. But still having those perpetual savings that the water managers can count on. And we were able to get an assurance from the division engineer to say, yes, if you've got these conservation easements in the works with folks, we're absolutely going to count that as progress towards the San Luis Valley's goals of meeting aquifer sustainability. We're also working in partnership with the Rio Grande Water Conservation District to create a formal water conservation program, so that if somebody enters into a conservation easement with Colorado Open Lands or the local land trust, that property would actually be enrolled technically in a conservation program of the district, so that those water rights couldn't be abandoned. They would actually really be saved in the aquifer. And also really to help us leverage enforcement as well. So conservation easements have certain legal enforceability, but really with the district being on the ground and keeping records of everyone's pumping, it was kind of a natural alignment to say, let's put in options so that if there's really kind of egregious over pumping against what someone's restriction is, the district would actually take that well out of their annual replacement plan that they have to give to the state. And the state at that point would step in to essentially order a cease and desist against that well from pumping. So we've got flexibility for the landowner, but we've also really got enforcement mechanisms between the land trust and the conservation district. But one of the other key things that this really brings to the table is that it leverages additional funding. So we can bring to bear both the tax benefits of conservation easements, as well as some of the funding sources that fund conservation easements, like Great Outdoors Colorado, like Natural Resources Conservation Service funding programs. So Colorado Open Lands actually applied last fall for a regional conservation partnership program grant, which would kind of kick this program off and not only pay for conservation easements, but ideally also pay for some technical assistance and help that farmer actually transition their operation over time. So we recognize that this isn't, this isn't a silver bullet by any means, but it's an additional tool for a community to really try to address a unique water challenge, and to do so in a way that ideally works for them, but also could work in other groundwater basins across the West. And so with that, I will actually turn it over to Ed, who is also working very closely with a community to try to address their unique regional water challenges. So I will stop sharing and turn it over to you, Ed.
All right, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And let me share my screen as well. All right. Yeah, I'm Ed Robertson, Conservation Director at Palmer Land Trust. And I looked through the list of attendees and saw a lot of familiar names on there. So I'm happy to be doing this. Thanks so much to Water Education Colorado for having us and for writing that great article in the magazine. It's really exciting stuff that we're working on, and I'm glad that there's an interest in it. Palmer Land Trust, or Palmer Land Conservancy now. We were Palmer Land Trust for a long time and just did a rebrand in late 2020. And we are a regional land trust focusing on the southeastern quadrant of Colorado. And we have three main areas of focus: outdoor, recreational open space, working farms and ranches, and scenic views. And my work at Palmer is really focused on the agricultural side of things. And so I'm going to walk you through very high level a project that we're doing called the Bessemer Farmland Conservation Project in eastern Pueblo County. That's very exciting, and I think has some implications that could be applied to any water starved region of the West. So let me just head through this, and I'll preface that I could talk about this for 3 or 4 hours and still not get to all of it. And so you guys are always welcome to reach out, and I can talk about this all day. So this is a map of kind of the region we operate in. You can see Colorado Springs up here, and then Pueblo, and then the Arkansas River Valley through here. And this map is pretty interesting because it shows the green indicates properties, farms that are still under irrigation, and the yellow indicates properties that were under irrigation and they were dried up. And when I'm telling this story about the Bessemer project, I found that it makes a lot of sense to explain kind of a worst case scenario of what we're trying to avoid. And so when you look at Crowley County, which is here that I'm circling, you can see that the majority of the farms there are yellow. And that was because in the 70s and 80s, municipalities came to the farmers and they said, we need water. We're growing, our cities are growing, we need to buy water. Can we buy it from you? And the farmers sold. And that I think it's free market, and they they need to do what was right for their operations and their families. And so they sold. And over the course of that time, about 90 to 95% of the irrigated farmland in Crowley County sold. There's still some working farms there. My colleague, Matt Heimrich, he is still farming there, and his family is doing great things, but you can see the contrast here of what happened. And when you think about drying up these farms, the main issue is that it needs to be done mindfully. And because in Crowley County, you can see that the water was taken out and there was not much thought put into, all right, what's this going to look like 20 years from now, 30 years from now? And so when you fast forward to today, that dry up of those farms has resulted in It's been pretty detrimental from an ecological standpoint. It's been pretty detrimental from an economic standpoint and from a cultural standpoint. And this picture is, or there's a great article, and I'll put it in the chat when I get finished talking, in 5280 from a few years back that I always pass along to people who are trying to understand the implications of buy and dry. And it's just 5280.com/Crowley. But this is, if you want to learn more, go to this. And actually my colleague Matt is profiled in this. So this is a picture that was taken out that way, actually a little farther east. But when they dried up the farmland out there, there was not a lot of effort put into revegetation. And so there's a lot of bare ground out there, a lot of weeds. And, you know, I've been out there on days when it looks like the Dust Bowl from the 1930s. And I always say with this photo, if it was in black and white, it very well could be from the Dust Bowl from the 1930s. And so, you know, that's obviously not great from an environmental standpoint. And then from an economic standpoint, you know, this is dated data here, but Crowley County, you know, was in the 40s, 50s, 60s, a very vibrant agricultural community. And over the course of drying up all that farmland, it eroded the tax base, it eroded the culture of the region. And now you can see this very, very dark spot there, and it's one of the poorest counties in the United States. And you know, what used to be this agricultural hub has now the main contributor to the tax base is a for-profit prison. And so it's just this drastic change that, you know, very well could have been avoided. And obviously, you know, these cities, if you look at the projections for population, and people like me with my Southern accent from North Carolina moving here, there's going to have to be water taken off of farms. But what our Bessemer project is saying is, let's figure out a way to do it mindfully, and figure out a way to do it so that really everybody can win. So this gets back to this map. And the Bessemer project is based here in Pueblo County. You can see there's a lot of green still there, very little dry up compared to some of the other areas. And so what we see is a great opportunity here to dry up in a way that makes sense, so that cities can expand. The city of Pueblo, if they want to expand their city, if they need to lease or sell the water to other municipalities, but also keep the farming, the base of their economy, the farming, in place. And so in 2009, Pueblo Board of Waterworks went out to farmers along the Bessemer Ditch. And so if you can see, this is the Arkansas River, if you can see my cursor, and then this black line is the Bessemer Ditch. And so this Bessemer Ditch irrigates all of this farmland. It's about 20,000 acres. And the city of Pueblo is right here. And so every farm that is highlighted in red here, in 2009, they sold their water to Pueblo Board of Waterworks. And it was really an innovative project by Pueblo Board of Waterworks, because I think they knew that if they didn't raise this money and they didn't figure out how to buy this water, somebody else would. And so they bought the water from the farmers. They, in fair open market transactions, paid them well for it. And now Pueblo has secured their water future. I mean, they have this very robust water portfolio. They lease the water back to the farmers for 20 years through 2029. And so when you're down there driving around, like I'm sure many of you have been, it's business as usual. You know, it's this great agricultural community. They've got the farm stands. They grow the world famous Pueblo chili, which I said that in New Mexico one time and literally got booed off the stage. But it's just this really great community, and all based on the need to irrigate this land, because this area gets about 13 or 14 inches of rain a year. So without irrigation, there really is no farming. And so knowing that in 2029, or as they're extending some leases, so it could be 2039, there's going to be farms that get dried up, because they're going to be taking water off of some of these farms and applying that water to the growth of Pueblo, as they are in their rights to do. They pay fair and square for that water. And so what we're saying is, and what we're proposing is, that if you're going to dry up land, and they are, why not do it in a way that makes sense for everybody? And so about 5 years ago, before I was even at Palmer, there was a community-based a community-based coalition that came together to figure out a way forward. And when you compare the two places, and the water purchases. Crowley County, you know, that it was driven by outsiders. Municipalities came in, bought the water, took it out, and it's kind of a win-lose situation. And it was destructive or detrimental from environmental, economically, and socially. Whereas in Pueblo, we got this great opportunity for a community-driven solution to sharing water and using water for both ag and for municipal expansion. It can be a win-win-win. It can, we can conserve land and water, and then it boosts, you know, local food production, local economy, and it protects Pueblo's agricultural heritage. And so these are just a few of the partners that have come together to help address this. And I put Palmer down here at the very bottom on purpose because we're a facilitator. Without the local community leading this and being the driver of this, it doesn't matter. You know, we could be sitting in our office having the greatest ideas in the world, and unless it is driven by the local community, it's not going to work. But as the project has built up steam, you know, we've attracted everybody from, you know, the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, who was very, very early in this process, to consultants to Colorado State, to Harvard University, impact investment funds, private equity funds, and it's only continuing to build momentum. And so high level, what we did was the water, as Pueblo was going through their change case to convert the water from agricultural use to municipal use, which was mostly during 2020, we worked with them to get a provision put in that water court change case that in the final decree that allows for water to be transferred from one parcel to another. And so the way that would work practically is you see like this parcel I'm pointing to here in red, and then this parcel in green. So the one in green sold its water back in 2009 and is under the threat of being dried up. And it's also on some of the most productive farmland as defined by NRCS soil maps. So we obviously don't want this parcel to be dried up. So why not take, if you're going to dry up something, and it will be dried up at some point, let's move the water, the owned water, from one of these less productive parcels to the most productive parcel, dry up the less productive parcel, and then keep the most productive parcel in production forever. And when it's all said and done, put a conservation easement on it. And so that was a real, you know, this was all a theoretical idea that was, you know, that had been written up in this great report. But starting in, you know, when that provision was put in the change case, it went from theoretical to implementation. And so what we've got now is we've got this voluntary market-based water exchange framework that allows farmers to move water from one parcel to another and keep the most productive ones in production forever. And it allows us to be very strategic about which parcels are dried up. And then once we transfer the water, move it from the less productive to the most, we lock that in with a conservation easement, as Sarah was mentioning, and then we revegetate the remaining, the dried up parcels. And Pueblo Water has committed to revegetating those in a way that was not done in Crowley County. And so at the end of the day, it maintains agriculture as the economic driver of Pueblo County. And what I think one of the reasons that this project has been so exciting and has, you know, caught on and gained a lot of momentum is that funders and other partners see this as the main ideas that we're dealing with here is something that could possibly be applied in other regions of the West that are dealing with these same issues. And so it's very exciting. And, you know, here are just a few pictures. Thanks to Russ Schnitzer at Gates Family Foundation for these great photos. But it shows how much agriculture is a part of this community, both from the economic side to the scenic vista side to the business side. And everything in Eastern Pueblo County revolves around this. And so if we can help facilitate, you know, a market-based scalable process that allows these farms to stay in production, we're honored to have the opportunity to do that. And so I'll put that link to the Crowley County article in chat, and then I'll be quiet. And feel I'm more than happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Ed. And Sarah and Melissa, all interesting, great projects. So we're going to, I'll flash my screen so you guys can see those instructions about asking a question again, but we're going to turn it over to you. So I'll just remind you as audience members that if you joined us late and have a question, you can go to the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and then click the raise hand button. And Scott will be kind of monitoring to see if folks are raising their hands. And then he'll call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask your questions.
One thing I'll add real quick, and I'll put it in the notes, is that a few years ago, Palmer Land Conservancy gave Colorado Open Lands a Southeastern Conservation Award for its work with the acequias down in the San Luis Valley. And it was a really cool video that Sarah is featured in. And I think it was very educational to me. And so I'll put a link to that as well, because it really highlights some of the work that Colorado Open Lands is doing down there. And it's very inspiring stuff. So I'm gonna dig that up and put it in the notes.
Thanks, Ed. So I've got a couple questions coming through. The first one, maybe this is best for you, Ed. Is Crowley County effectively lost, in quotations, or can a similar strategy be devised for its resuscitation?
I would say definitely not lost. You can talk to Matt Heinrich, my colleague, and he could speak a lot better about it than I could, but they're doing great things out there, and they're still very committed farmers and people that for generations have been committed to agriculture in that region. And, very high level, but Palmer is exploring some potential projects similar to our Bessemer project that would be a landscape scale assessment of the area and trying to figure out ways to help enhance what's left and possibly try to figure out ways to bring some water back. And when you think about some of the work that some organizations are doing around young farmers and trying to figure out ways to get young people involved in farming, I think there's a really, really good opportunity out there for that area to really be revitalized in one way or another. And Matt is very passionate about that. And, I'm of the mindset that now that I'm in this conservation world, everybody that I work with, both at Palmer and all my colleagues at other organizations, they're just so smart and so passionate, and it's so optimistic. And I say that genuinely. And I think that there are great opportunities out there, and it's just a matter of being very creative and being extremely hard-nosed about executing on our plans, because that's what's happened with Bessemer. I didn't put the plan in place. I'm helping to execute it, but it is very inspiring that these super smart people with good ideas can combine with local communities and make this stuff happen. So I think there's only upside out there. And I'm generally a pessimist, so I fully believe that, though.
Great, thanks, Ed. Here's another one for you. The question is there a comprehensive report online about the Bessemer project? And if so, would you be willing to drop it in the chat for everybody to access?
Yes, there is. Sarah was actually involved in this. We had a big convening a little over a year ago down in Pueblo, where we brought together a lot of the country's best water experts, and it was funded by Harvard University, came together and had people like Sarah try to poke holes in our theories and make it better and make sure that we're in a good spot to execute. And there was a report that was published as part of that, and it's published for Harvard. And so I'll find a link to that. I've got it on a Google Drive, put it in. It's very interesting, about 40 pages. There's a good executive summary if you don't want to dig into all of it, but it gives a very, very good overview of the project and then some of the things we discussed during that convening. So yeah, I will put that in the notes as well.
Great, thanks, Ed. And
yep.
I'm going to shift the ground rules a little bit, Caitlin, if that's all right. I see a few hands up, so I want to honor the one hand that I see, but if you could start typing your questions in the chat, I think it'll be easier just to monitor everything in one place if you're able to do that. So the one hand I see raised right now is Don Shawcroft. Don, are you willing to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, mine's really basically a simple question, but you're talking about the Bessemer Ditch and the project there. I saw that you were trying to preserve and maintain production on the most productive land. What percentage do you think of those lands that have sold their water right to Pueblo, do you feel like you're going to be able to keep in production, and will that production be changed so that there's less water use? Is that part of the plan as well? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the kind of side projects of the Bessemer project that we're doing right now is we're doing a very detailed economic impact analysis that measures what the impact of a dry up would be, and then offers solutions. And we're actually partnering with the Freshwater Trust to come up with some GIS-based mapping software to really figure out, like, help make decisions or help the local community make decisions about which properties should be put in place. The reality with this project is that it's a long-term thing. I mean, it could take decades to get to the end goal of, like, 2,000 to 3,000 acres conserved, but we've got a runway, which is good. As Pueblo has been extending the leases, it was 2029. And so there was some concern, like that was almost a drop dead date. We got to get this done by then. But because they're extending the leases, it allows for there's not as much pressure. There's not as much like it's got to be done now or it's lost. And the way we anticipate this working out at some point down the future is there would be almost a self-sustaining organization, possibly separate from Palmer, that would help facilitate these transactions. So it would be, fully driven by the local community. And so we see this as a process that's going to play out over years. And, I don't know that we've done any real predictions. It may be in this economic impact analysis that will be coming out soon. But, our hope is that, given the time frames, given the lease lengths, and the fact that it is driven by the local community, that we have enough time to make that happen and conserve as much of that land as possible. I hope that answers the question.
Follow up. Do you have a percentage or number of acres that you're targeting? Is your goal to maintain in production?
Yeah, our overall goal right now is 2,000 acres, which is a lot when you think about the farms down there are anywhere from 30 to, some of them are up to 200 acres, 250 acres, depending on the landowner. But our overall goal that we are shooting for is 2,000 of the approximately it's right around 5,000 that sold water across the full spectrum of rankings. But it's worth noting, I say that when you're talking about farms on the Bessemer Ditch, if you're trying to rank it, I say it's like you're having to rank the NBA All-Star team. It's all good. I mean, it's all just excellent. And it's some of the most productive farmland in the Rocky Mountain West. But, it makes it tough to figure out exactly what would be classified as the best. It's kind of a loose term, really.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Caitlin, do we have time for one more question?
Let's take one more question. And then I know we have so many great questions in the chat, and not sure if folks still have their hands raised, but I don't know if our speakers would be interested in sticking around a little bit longer, and then we can also share your questions with them and maybe send a typed up response to some of these if we don't get through most of them. But for folks who need to sign off immediately, I'm going to share a survey link because we would love your feedback. You'll also get that by email, but be sure to fill that out. So Scott, if you want to keep it running through questions, go ahead.
That's great. Thanks, Caitlin. And shameless plug for those of you who are really interested in Crowley County, the history of the issues around there. The WECO annual River Basin tour will be in the lower Arkansas River Basin this year, and it will be virtual. So hopefully many of you can join us for an in-depth look at issues in the lower Ark. And so, okay, so with the remaining time we have before 1 o'clock, I'm gonna use my prerogative to ask a overarching question raised by Nancy, and she's running for city council, specifically in Colorado Springs, and she's wondering what kinds of things that local governments can be doing to proactively and effectively support these efforts. And I'm going to start with Melissa, if you're willing to talk at that strategic level.
Yeah, happy to do that. Thank you. And thanks, Nancy, for that question. I just wrote her a private message back in fear that we may not get to it. But I would say one of the biggest things that local governments can do is have a strong relationship with both their local land trust and land trusts that serve in their region that may be larger regional statewide land trusts. As Sarah was saying, there's a lot of partnership between Colorado Open Lands and a local land trust, Rio Grande Headwaters Land Trust. I think that if we can start to bring a lens of conservation work into community planning, we will all be better for it. And I say that with the understanding that a lot of our land trusts have the relationships with the private landowning community, with local agriculture, with even the outdoor, rec organizations and community that can really drive better planning for a more sustainable future for our local government and communities across the state. So I really encourage local governments to be really engaged in the conservation work that the land trusts are doing, because that conservation work, as Ed was pointing out, as Sarah's pointing out, is community driven. And if we can bring that conservation lens to what sustainable growth needs to look like for communities and encourage more conservation that ends with more connection for more people to nature and more connected landscapes, again, I think that serves everybody well. And so I just always encourage people to get in touch with those land trusts and engage them when there's community planning efforts, and understand that those land trusts, based on the community's feedback, often have areas that are high priority for conservation efforts that you want to avoid development, or already have plans in place for appropriate development based on water needs. And I think that there's just a lot of opportunity for land trusts to help advise what the next steps can be for communities too.
Thank you, Melissa.
Add anything to that?
Sarah, did you want to add anything, or should we move to the next question?
Just say thanks, Nancy. It's really exciting to see somebody running for public office and asking that question. I think that, it's easy to leave things to water resource departments who do an amazing job of meeting cities' water needs. But I think that, understandably, they are focused on quantity and security, and not necessarily always creative options. And I think that, the work of Ed and Palmer is really amazing in saying, how do we meet those needs, but do it in a little bit more strategic, smart way. And I think also looking at leasing options where that's a possibility, like for drought recovery supplies. I'm hopeful that more and more cities will start really exploring those options. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think we have to. Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nancy. Caitlin, turning it back to you. Would we like to answer these by email, or should we keep moving through? If we keep moving through, I'll just go in order of the questions we've gotten so far.
I would say it's up to our speakers. If you guys are open to it, I would propose sticking around until 1:15 if folks are still here and have questions. Okay, then let's do that. And of course, this is all being recorded if you are on the line and have to hop off. So Scott, we can move on to the next one and see where we get by 1:15.
Great. This question comes from Tim. So can the water transactions Colorado Open Lands and Palmer Land Conservancy are pursuing avoid triggering legal abandonment of the water rights?
I can speak to that first. Most of the time conservation easements are keeping water in use, and certainly I know Colorado Open Lands, and I think others have successfully kind of fended off abandonment challenges on our conserved properties, showing that the intent was to keep that perpetual use of the water right. On our project, where we're kind of saying, don't use some of your water intentionally, we definitely worked through that concern of abandonment. And really the way we get there is by using the part of the abandonment statute that says, that it shall not be, a water right would not be tolled for abandonment if it is participating in a water conservation program of an entity like a water conservation district. And so the board, in our case, the board of the Rio Grande Water Conservation District is formally adopting a water conservation program that says if someone puts their well right into a conservation easement, they are formally participating in our program. So would not be told for abandonment.
Yeah, and I would echo that. And my colleague Amber Shanklin handles a lot of the stewardship issues and the drafting of the conservation easements. But just my general overview with all this work with agricultural producers is that, Palmer, we're here to help, and the last thing we want to do is put some restriction that's going to mess up the ability to run the agricultural operation in a profitable way. And so we view ourselves as partners. And so I think our stewardship department at Palmer is very, very aware of making sure that we avoid any sort of confusion like that, because the last thing we want to do is impede the ability for farmers to grow crops or for ranchers to grow hay. And so that's just kind of my overarching thought on our role with these agricultural producers.
Great, thanks, Ed. And maybe that's a nice segue to another legal and technical question here, which is, and I just lost it. Let's see. Have any Colorado land trusts or conservancies utilized the use of a federal tax deduction to help incentivize any part of the water transaction that might include a donative component? So you used federal tax deduction.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this. I appreciate Tom's question, and I think Tom has been working on transactions that deal with water rights a little bit more standalone, from what I recall. But these transactions are a little bit more traditionally involving both the land and water rights together in a conservation easement, and so we're able to take advantage of the federal tax deduction for conservation easements specifically. And I know we do anticipate some of that donative component for the projects that we're working on.
Great. And then back to the question about water rights. So what measures are in place to ensure that water conserved toward the aquifer goal, so I'm assuming this is in the San Luis Valley, is not lost to the latest or newest water right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this case, again, because the entire water right is being included in the conservation easement, and because of this participation in a water conservation program, the water right can't be lost, can't be used by another water user, can't be claimed. So the water right is staying intact, even though only a portion of it is being used.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And then next one. So this one's for Ed. And this person's asking you to talk a little bit more about the details of your program. So can you please explain a bit more about the impacts on the landowners that fallow their land and send the water to more productive parcels? So Sally's assuming these landowners are not moving the water to other parcels that they own, but to land owned by others. And are they being paid like a CREP program for their fallowing? Is the payment perpetual? And what is the incentive to them to give up their water and stop being an ag?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a lot of that is addressed in the report that I posted. Basically, there are a lot of different ways that these exchanges could take place, and in that report that I put there are 3 different case studies. And like for example, we're right now we're focused on doing a pilot project. We're proving the concept. You know, we've got the legal go ahead to do these things, and so we are working out all the kinks and how do you exchange these things. And then, as I mentioned, we see it being able to go at scale and farmers being able to do that as they want. And so, like one example would be a farmer, and we're seeing this happen actually right now, is that some of the properties that sold their water back in 2009 are coming on the market for sale. And so they're coming on the market. They've got 8 years left on the lease. And so we're seeing farmers who own properties where they own their water, but it may be a property with less productive soils. They are looking to buy these properties on the market and then do the exchange that way. And so they would get this more highly productive farm, get owned water on it, and then they would move. Basically, they're moving the dry up covenant onto the less productive farm. And so one thing to remember is that you're moving the lease water over as well. And so for as long as that lease is in place, which could right now be through 2039 as they're extending the leases, it's going to continue to be business as usual. At some point, whenever Pueblo Water decides, all right, we need some of this water, then they'll take it off. But the whole framework is market-based and voluntary. You know, nobody is telling anybody what to do. And there's actually a value proposition, given the current real estate values down there and the current water values, of ways that farmers could transfer water and actually make a little bit of money doing it, which my background before I got into conservation is business and real estate. And so I feel like the best way to make these things scale is if we can figure out ways for producers to make money. And as of right now, theoretically there is. And so if you check out that report, and then feel free to reach out to me, I can talk about it all day, but there are kind of three main buckets of how we would see these exchanges taking place, and Palmer would be a facilitator and a financial partner in several of those. But our goal is to help these farmers do what's best for their operation, and however we can bring resources and expertise, let us at it.
Thanks, Ed. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, and maybe one more question here, one or two, depending on how long this one takes. But this is shifting back to something Melissa talked about in terms of protecting riparian areas. So this person, Buffy, is curious about how the land trust community can implement stream corridor easements. Can you speak more to Keep It Colorado's work with CWCB and how alternative valuation methods might help address this challenge?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Buffy, and thanks, Scott. I did send her a little note privately too. So, our work with CWCB is just beginning, and we hope to engage more of our members who want to be more directly involved in their basin roundtable conversations as we update the water plan, because I think opportunities like this, like Buffy mentions, of finding ways to work on stream corridor easements is innovative and exciting, and I think again better aligns the work of the private land conservation community with the water objectives of the water plan. So CWCB is also involved in our conversations around alternative valuation, and so we've got some subgroups forming specifically focused on water, and we'll continue to have conversations like that. And I think more to come is really the best way that I can answer that. There will be definitely more opportunities for the land trust community and the land conservation community to get more directly involved in the updates both to the water plan and the objectives that are reflected there, but also in our planning efforts and the water objectives that we include there too.
If I may too, I'll just add really quickly, one of the things that it's kind of a stalled project, but one of the things that we've been working at Colorado Open Lands is exploring that same kind of question along the acequia corridors where we work, where there's a lot of landowners, there's smaller parcels. It doesn't necessarily make financial sense to do conservation easements separately on every single one of those parcels. And so we've been looking at, can we create kind of a collective conservation easement model where it's a single conservation easement across an entire ditch, an entire acequia in that case. And the transaction costs are really, then spread and reduced across that as well. So would love to talk to you more about that sometime, Buffy, too.
Thanks. That sounds like a great idea.
All right. Well, we're at 1:15, our extended end time. So I think we'll cut it off here. I have saved our chat, so I'll share any remaining questions with our speakers and we can see if we can get back to you. So thank you to Melissa, Sarah, and Ed, and everyone who's on the line today. Really interesting and great. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody.